The Song of Roland is an 11th century French epic. It is estimated that it was written between the years 1040 and 1115, and it is one of the earliest examples of the chanson de geste, which is a French form of epic poetry based on a narrative that would have been recited by troubadours largely from the 11th to maybe the 15th century or so. There's only one extant manuscript of the Song of Roland, and it's kept at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. The poem was in general written in Old French, and the manuscript that's at Oxford is in specifically the Anglo-Norman dialect of Old French. In 1832 and 1835, there were two manuscripts found, and it thereafter was published in 1837, and it became the national epic of France. So to put it simply, it's approximately the French equivalent of Beowulf. It centers on an event that we today call the Battle of Roncevaux Pass, but there are some important differences between the historical accounts of the battle and what's portrayed in the Song of Roland. But before getting into that, it's worth it to talk about Charlemagne, or Charles the Great. The name Charlemagne comes from the Latin Carolus Magnus, which just means Charles the Great. And in fact, in his original language, his name was Karl. And there are many European languages in which that is today the word for a king. The way that a czar comes from the name Caesar. The title used thereafter came from the name of a specific guy. That's the same here, though it doesn't really work in English because our word for king doesn't come from Karl. But it does in many European languages, and that's because of Charles the Great. But he was a major force in Western Europe from 768 until his death 46 years later in 814. He united the majority of Western and Central Europe and was the first recognized emperor to rule from Western Europe since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century, which was 300 years earlier or so. And for that reason, he is sometimes called the Father of Europe. He inherited a pretty well-functioning state, and he expanded it into what came to be known as the Carolingian Empire. And that was the first phase of what we now call the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted for another 1,000 years in various forms. Charles the Great is also a direct ancestor of a number of European royal families, most notably the House of Habsburg. But it is under the rule and leadership of Charles the Great that the Battle of Roncevaux Pass happens. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but there was a campaign into the Iberian Peninsula, into what we today call Spain, and this is the actual historical version. And we have this because of a Frankish scholar named Einhard, who was a servant of Charles the Great and wrote his biography and also kept a lot of his records. And so we know something about what happened at this battle, not because his account is even necessarily perfect, but he was a contemporary. He was working for Charles the Great at the time, and his job was to record an accurate description of this event. He wasn't trying to write an interesting poem about it or entertain an audience. He was just writing down facts. But anyway, the historical version is that Charles the Great took an army into Iberia and, among other things, besieged a town from whom he then accepted a payment in order to lift the siege and go home, which then he did. But then on the way home, his rear guard was ambushed in the mountains, returning to what we today call France. And the entire rear guard was wiped out. Einhard says that they were, quote, massacred to the last man, end quote. And they were ambushed by Basque tribesmen, either as retribution for destroying the walls of the city that they had besieged, or because there might have been some looting in some areas around the siege, and the attack by the Basques was retribution for that. And it happened very quickly. And though Charles the Great personally was up ahead in the train of men that was returning to France, by the time they were able to go backward to see what was going on, the attack was basically over and everyone had been massacred. Charles the Great did have a general named Roland, and he and other important leaders were killed in this attack. And not only that, but the payment that the Frankish army had received for lifting its siege was all captured. So this was a pretty significant loss for Charles the Great, and maybe the biggest and only significant loss in his military career, which was otherwise very successful. Now, some of the differences between the historical account and what is described in the Song of Roland are that in the poem, the enemy are generally described as Muslims, whereas Umayyad accounts of Andalusia, of Muslim Spain and the people there, describe the Basques generally as pagans or some kind of magi, rather than as people of the book, that is, Muslims, Christians, or Jews. Though, of course, history is messy. There very well could have been a group of Basques who converted to Islam when the Umayyads came in. It would be useful to read Einhard's account in full to see what he says about that. Also, the poem describes a victorious counterattack, that after the initial attack, Charles the Great and his guys go and wreak revenge on the attackers, even by going back into the Iberian Peninsula, which didn't happen. In fact, this campaign, punctuated by this disastrous battle, basically ended Charles the Great's expeditions into that area. The poem also describes Charles as being 200 years old at the time of this battle and having a big white beard, whereas in fact he was only 31 years old. It was relatively early in his reign that this happened. The bit about Charles being 200 years old is one of very few fantastical details in the story. There's another character who's referred to as being steeped in evil art, which may be a reference to sorcery. But other than that, things happen mostly in accordance with the laws of nature, which might separate it a bit more from Beowulf, which of course has mythical monsters as a central part of the story, being Grendel, his mother, and the dragon. Anyway, the differences between the details of the history of the battle and what is told in the Song of Roland may be accounted for in part by the fact that the battle happened in the 8th century and the written manuscript that we have is from the late 11th or early 12th century. So in the 300 years that passed, even if it started out as being relatively close to the events, though it might not have been, whoever first wrote this poem might have not had access to very good information. Even if it started out pretty loyal to the facts, over time it would have changed gradually if it weren't written down. That happens very often with oral accounts of any event. One of the cool details about this poem is that the horses and swords of the main characters all have names. Now, unfortunately, the names are sort of difficult to pronounce, but for example, Roland's sword was called Durendal, and his horse was called Valentif. And then his friend Oliver's sword was called Halteclair. Charles the Great's sword was called Joyeux, and Charles's horse is called Tencendur. And there's a traitor in the story whose name is sometimes translated as Ganelon, or given as Ganelon. But in the translation I read, his name was something like Gwenis or Genis, and his horse's name was Takabron. And there's a lot of interesting linguistic things in this poem, but because we're not reading it in the original Old French, we're reading a translation, we don't know exactly how these word usages would have fit with the Old French, but it's still interesting to see how people in the past, how a translator would use his words. And the translation of the Song of Roland that I read was by Charles Kenneth Scott Moncrieff, who himself spent 3 years on the Western Front in World War I before he was seriously injured by an exploding shell, and so then he was lame for the rest of his life, though he was able to avoid having his legs amputated. And this translator, whose name is often given as C.K. Scott Moncrieff, used the word Saracen often, which certainly makes sense in this context. It's sort of a Middle Ages word for either an Arab or a Muslim. But the etymology of that word is not really clear. I'm always interested in trying to chase down the etymology of unusual words, and it occurred to me I had no idea where Saracen comes from. And there isn't a great answer for it. It comes from a Latin word that comes from a Greek word whose origin is not clear. And often, if you look at a word in a language, like, for example, in English, let's look at the word fireplace. It's very obvious how that word breaks down. Fireplace. Now, we could talk about where does fire come from, where does place come from, but we see the components of that word. Now, the word for cavalry in English, that word cavalry, is not quite as obvious to an English speaker. Now, I haven't looked it up, but I'm pretty sure, because I've been reading Song of Roland, it comes from something like chevalier, which is the word for knight. And this makes sense because it sounds sort of similar, and a knight, among other things, rides a horse, and cavalry in the past referred to military units on horseback. So that makes sense. But it doesn't really make sense to somebody who only speaks English and doesn't know any French, which, by the way, I don't know any French. I just know some of these words. But if you're looking at a word and you can't see any origin for that word, you might be dealing with a loan word. It's not always the case, but it might be that that word comes from a different language. And if you speak another language, you'll know what I'm talking about. I can see this in Turkish because there are words that in Turkish you can break down the etymology and you go, oh, this comes from that and this comes from that, so it must be this. But if it looks just completely foreign, then you're more likely to say, this must be a foreign word. It must come from Arabic or something. And the thing is, so this Greek word, Saracen in English, comes from something in Latin, comes from something in Greek that doesn't really resemble Greek. What they think that it might be is that it comes from the Arabic Sharqiyin or Sharqun, which is something like people from the East or Easterners, because Sharq means East, and the suffix un is just the plural form of that. So Saracen might originally just mean Easterners. But though C.K. Scott Moncrieff used the word Saracen, we don't know what was used in the Old French. I was pleased to see in passing a mention by Charles the Great in this poem of the feast Noel, which is, of course, what we today call Christmas, though we still use the word Noel, and in many languages, that's their word for Christmas. For example, I think in French, that's the word for Christmas. But it's nice to think about Christmas as a tradition going back at least 1,200 years, if as nothing else but a feast in which they celebrated the birth of Christ, and it was dark and cold, and so they maybe lit some candles or something to have some fun and be warm. That while the modern form of it, of course, with all the gifts and everything, is relatively new, and I don't know the exact history of the tree, at least having a feast at Christmas goes back at least 1,000 years to when whoever was writing this poem was writing it, and probably much earlier than that. But it's nice to see it there in the old text. The poem also mentions the oriflamme, which was the banner of the King of France throughout the Middle Ages and later. It's a red banner that's got points on the edges, and it was apparently originally the banner of the Abbey of Saint Denis in Paris, but it came to mean that when that banner was flown, no quarter would be given. The French army would not be taking prisoners, and this was, of course, meant to frighten the enemy, in particular the nobility, who maybe were leading some of the troops, who could often hope to be taken for ransom and then sold back. But that banner, the oriflamme, meant that no quarter would be given. And Saint Denis was a 3rd century bishop in Paris who was decapitated for his faith. And there's a Christian legend that after he was decapitated, he picked up his own head and walked for a few miles while preaching a sermon about repentance before he finally died. Then, at the place where he was buried, a chapel was raised, and around the chapel grew an abbey, and around the abbey grew what is now the city of Saint Denis in France, which is a suburb north of Paris. And the Basilica of Saint Denis is very beautiful. As Gothic architecture goes, the facade is relatively simple, but apparently the choir, which is the portion of the interior where the clergy and the choir sit, is widely considered to be the first structure to have all the elements of Gothic architecture. And I mentioned Saint Denis because he comes up again when you try to look into this word that appears several times in the Song of Roland, Montjoie, Montjoie. It was the first part of the battle cry and the motto of the Kingdom of France, and refers to the oriflamme, which was known as the Montjoie. The full battle cry was Montjoie Saint-Denis, but in the Song of Roland, they mostly just say Montjoie. But this is another case where the etymology is not particularly clear. Saint-Denis is, of course, a reference to that saint, Saint Denis. And the oriflamme was, as we said, the banner of that abbey. But there are a few different explanations for the etymology of Montjoie, and there isn't one that has an obvious advantage over all the others. Now we can get into some passages. Without going into too much detail, we can summarize the setup like this. As I said, the Frankish army under Charlemagne is ready to return to France, to what we today call France, and they want to set peace terms with the Saracens in northeastern Spain. So Charles the Great asks his advisors, the group of leaders that are closest to him, whom they think he should send to the Saracens to carry a message giving peace terms. And Roland recommends his stepfather, Gennes, Guenes, and they all agree that he should go. And then Gennes is mad at Roland for recommending him because he might get killed doing this. And he says, if I make it back alive, I'll never forgive you and I'll hold my wrath against you till the end of my days. But so then he goes to meet with Marsile, who is the king of the Saracens, the king of the Muslims in that area. And the spelling of Marsile is different from the spelling of the French city of Marseille. So I'm pronouncing it Marsile. And while he's there, Gennes strikes a separate deal with Marsile to try to kill Roland. Marsile wants to know how he can get Charles the Great off his back, not just on this campaign, but in the future also. And Gennes tells him, you got to get rid of Roland. Roland is his most powerful commander. If you get rid of him, you've mostly dealt with Charles. And that's what's going on in this first passage that I'm going to read now. Marsile speaks first. Quote, the pagan says, you make me marvel sore at Charlemagne, who is so old and hoar. 200 years, they say, he's lived and more. So many lands he's led his armies o'er. So many blows from spears and lances borne, and so rich kings brought down to leg and sword. When will time come that he draws back from war? Never, says Gennes, so long as lives his nephew. No such vassal goes neath the dome of heaven. And proof also is Oliver, his henchman, the dozen peers whom Charles holds so precious. These are his guards, with other thousands 20. Charles is secure, he holds no man in terror. End quote. And I hadn't mentioned that Roland is the nephew of Charles also. But Gennes says it more explicitly elsewhere that Roland is who Marsile has to get rid of. And you notice in the first passage that the translator put some work into trying to keep the meter of the original. Though it sometimes means the words are in an unusual order or that an unusual word is used, the meter of this translation is very nice. And Marsile and Gennes talk a while longer, and then finally Marsile gets him to swear on it. Quote, said Marsile, but now what more said they? No faith in words, by oath unbound I lay. Swear me the death of Roland on that day. Then answered Gennes, so be it, as you say. On the relics are in his sword Mergilus. Treason he's sworn, forsworn his faith away. End quote. There the poet gives the name of Gennes' sword, which is Mergilus. Though Mahom, or Muhammad, is mentioned many times in the poem, the homogeneity of the force against which the Franks are fighting is not at all clear for a couple reasons. One is that there are some Arabic names, some Arabic sounding names that are given. One is Escababi, another one is Al-Khalif. Al-Khalif is obviously the caliph. But then there are other names that just seem like pre-Christian European names. And also, more than once, Muhammad is mentioned side by side with two other figures. One of them is Apolline, which sounds kind of like Apollo, but I have no idea. And the other one is Tervagant. And if you look into what Tervagant is, some sources will say that this is a god that medieval Christian poetry says that Muslims believed in, but it's a slander. They didn't really believe in such a god. And obviously, if you're going by Islamic doctrine, there's no room for absolutely any other god at all. It's completely unacceptable. But if you imagine that the Umayyads had driven out the Visigoths and conquered Spain in part by allying with local tribes, paying some of them off, getting others to surrender under the threat of a war that they wouldn't win, then the resulting armies would not necessarily all be Arab Muslims with Arab Muslim-sounding names. They would be a coalition where some of them would be obviously Arab Muslim, or at least Muslim, and others might still be pagan even. Or they might have converted to Islam and not taken an Arab name. It's easy to make up some historical rule like this group of people always behaved in such and such a way, but it's much harder to exhaustively demonstrate that that was so in every case. So maybe this was something that medieval poets just made up, but it might also be that there were some pagans among this coalition. And so in the end, Gennis agrees to try to get Roland in charge of the rear guard of the army as it goes back into France so that Marsile can send a force to attack the rear guard and kill Roland. And if he can deliver, Marsile then promises Gennis a lot of wealth. Quote, Marsile's arm, Gennis' shoulder, doth enfold. He's said to him, you are both wise and bold. Now by the law that you most sacred hold, let not your heart in our behalf grow cold. Out of my store I'll give you wealth untold, charging 10 mules with fine Arabian gold. I'll do the same for you, new year and old. Take then the keys of this city so large, this great tribute present you first to Charles. Then get me placed Rollins in the rearward. If him I find in valley or in pass, battle I'll give him that shall be the last. Answers him Gennis, my time is nearly past. His charger mounts, and on his journey starts. End quote. So Gennis goes back to Charles, and when Charles asks who they think should be in the rear guard, Gennis recommends Roland. And Charles is angry at first because he says that Roland should be the first to enter the city, not coming in the back. He should have this honored position rather than the rear guard is not dishonorable. It's just not as prestigious as being in the very front of this train. But in the end, he accepts. Some of the commentary about the Song of Roland in general is about its role not as a historical account of this battle, which, as we saw, the historical details here are a little shaky, but rather as an expression of some of the knightly virtues in the Middle Ages that people admired at the time or that were seen as desirable. And of course, one of the traits that comes up is courage. 11 other leaders are appointed to stay with Roland, and they also have 1,000 soldiers with them each. So that makes up the rear guard, is these 12,000 soldiers. And among other things, they're described as follows. Quote, the dozen peers are left behind in Spain. Franks in their band 1,000 score remain. No fear have these. Death hold they in disdain. End quote. So they even disdain death. They don't care about death. Doesn't matter at all. And then also is the concern about shame and honor. We'll look a bit more at Charles's dreams later, but he has a bad dream that's sort of a premonition. And when one of the dukes, Duke Nemus, asks him about it, he tells him. Duke Nemus, quote, says to the king, what grief upon you weighs? Charles answers him, he's wrong, that question makes. So great my grief I cannot but complain. France is destroyed by the device of Gennis. This night I saw, by an angel's vision plain, between my hands he broke my spear in twain. Great fear I have, since Roland must remain. I've left him there, upon a border strange. God, if he's lost, I'll not outlive that shame. End quote. So he's worried about this bad dream that he had, and he says that if Roland dies, he won't outlive the shame of it, of having appointed him to go back and then having him get killed. There's then a description of one of the Saracen leaders. First, his land being cursed, and then what he says he's going to do to the Franks. Quote, from the other part, Chemubles of Munagre, right to the ground his fair hair swept either way. He for a jest would bear a heavier weight than 4 yoked mules beneath their load that strain. That land he had, God's curse on it was plain. No sun shone there, nor grew there any grain. No dew fell there, nor any shower or rain. The very stones were black upon that plain, and many say that devils there remain. Says Chemubles, my sword is in its place. At Rensevo scarlet I will it stain. Find I Roland the Proud upon my way. I'll fall on him, or trust me, not again. And Durendal I'll conquer with this blade. Franks shall be slain, and France a desert made. The dozen peers are, at this word, away. 5,000 of Saracens they take, who keenly press, and on to battle haste. End quote. This next passage I'm going to read is a bit longer, but it's both a critical moment in the story, and also it shows an effect that's used often, which is a kind of repetition, either of 2 or of 3 times, repeating the same moment or concept without the same words. The words change, but the moment that's described is the same, but it's described maybe from a different angle or emphasizing different details. So I found that rather than being tiresome, since a text like this is sort of hard to read, sometimes reading the same thing again or in a similar way gave you a much more vivid feeling of what was going on, and I like the effect. So what happens here is that while they're moving back to France, Oliver goes up on a hill or a mountain peak and sees the Saracen army that's about to attack them. And he then goes and tells Roland to sound his oliphant. The oliphant is the horn that he has with him. And obviously the word sounds like elephant. And these horns were in the shape of an elephant tusk, and they were often made of ivory from an elephant tusk, but I don't know if they always were. So it was named that either because it came from an elephant's tusk or possibly because the sound that it made resembled the sound that an elephant makes. And Oliver tells him to blow his horn in order to alert the train that they're about to be attacked so that they can come back and help them. And Roland refuses and says, I won't call for help against pagans. We can take care of this ourselves. And that's a moment where this concern about honor is actually very destructive. And there are a couple of unusual words in this passage. One is hauberk, which is the coat of mail, sort of a shirt of mail that soldiers would wear in the Middle Ages. And another is orfreyed. An orfrey is a kind of embroidery. So if something is orfreyed, it means it's embroidered, it's decorated with something. The poem reads, quote, Oliver mounts upon a lofty peak, looks to his right along the valley green. The pagan tribes approaching there appear. He calls Roland, his companion, to see. What sound is this come out of Spain we hear? What hauberks bright, what helmets these that gleam? They'll smite our Franks with fury past belief. He knew it, Gennis, the traitor and the thief, who chose us out before the king, our chief. Answers the Count Roland, Oliver, cease. That man is my good father. Hold thy peace. Upon a peak is Oliver mounted. Kingdom of Spain he sees before him spread, and Saracens so many gathered. Their helmets gleam with gold are jeweled, also their shields, their hauberks orfreyed, also their swords, ensigns on spears fixed. Rank beyond rank could not be numbered, so many there no measure could be set. In his own heart he's sore astonished, fast as he could down from the peak hath sped, comes to the Franks, to them his tale hath said. Says Oliver, pagans from there I saw, never on earth did any man see more. 'Gainst us their shields 100,000 bore, that laced helms and shining hauberks wore, and bolt upright their bright brown spearheads shone. Battle we'll have as never was before. Lords of the Franks, God keep you in valor, so hold your ground, we be not overborne. Then say the Franks, shame take him that goes off, if we must die, then perish one and all. Says Oliver, pagans in force abound, while of us Franks but very few I count. Comrade Roland, your horn I pray you sound. If Charles hear, he'll turn his armies round. Answers Roland, a fool I should be found, if France the deuce would perish my renown. With Durendal I'll lay on thick and stout, in blood the blade to its golden hilt I'll drown. Felon pagans to the pass shall not come down. I pledge you now to death they all are bound. Comrade Roland, sound the oliphant, I pray. If Charles hear, the host he'll turn again. Will succor us our king and baronage. Answers Roland, never, by God I say, for my misdeed shall kinsmen hear the blame, nor France the deuce fall into evil fame. Rather, stout blows with Durendal I'll lay, with my good sword that by my side doth sway, till bloodied o'er you shall behold the blade. Felon pagans are gathered to their shame. I pledge you now, to death they're doomed today. Comrade Roland, once sound your oliphant. If Charles hear where in the pass he stands, I pledge you now they'll turn again the Franks. Never, by God, then answers him Roland, shall it be said by any living man that for pagans I took my horn in hand. Never by me shall men reproach my clan, when I am come into the battle grand, and blows lay on by hundred, by thousand. Of Durendal bloodied you'll see the brand. Franks are good men. Like vassals brave they'll stand. Nay, Spanish men from death have no warrant. Says Oliver, in this I see no blame. I have beheld the Saracens of Spain, covered with them the mountains and the vales. The wastes I saw, and all the farthest plains. A muster great they've made this people strange. We have of men a very little tale. Answers Roland, my anger is inflamed. Never, please God, his angels and his saints. Never by me shall Frankish valor fail. Rather I'll die than shame shall me attain. Therefore strike on, the emperor's love to gain. Pride hath Roland, wisdom Oliver hath, and both of them show marvelous courage. Once they are horsed, once they have donned their arms, rather they die than from the battle pass. Good are the counts and lofty their language. Felon pagans come cantering in their wrath. Says Oliver, behold and see Roland. These are right near, but Charles is very far. On the oliphant, deign now to sound a blast. Were the king here, we should not fear damage. Only look up towards the pass of Asper. In sorrow, there you'll see the whole rearward. Who does this deed does no more afterward, answers Roland. Utter not such outrage. Evil his heart that is in thought coward. We shall remain firm in our place installed. From us the blows shall come, from us the assault. End quote. So one phrase that shows up a lot there is also France the Deuce. This shows up throughout the poem. France the Deuce means France the Sweet or Sweet France. So it's a name for France. So now we're getting into the fighting, and there are some descriptions of the violence. One guy's head is smashed in so his eyes pop out and his brains end up in the dust. One guy is sliced in half from head to groin on horseback. The fighters end up soaked in blood. Probably listeners at the time got a little bit of a kick out of that violence. It's similar to some of the violence that's described in the Iliad, though I would say it's a little more graphic. But those kinds of lines probably are 5 to 10 lines out of 4,000 of this poem. So the truly graphic descriptions of violence make up a very tiny portion of this poem. So that shouldn't be exaggerated. But there is a little bit of it in there. And then, amid the fighting, a storm breaks out. The Franks have lost the foremost of their band. They'll see no more their fathers nor their clans, nor Charlemagne, where in the pass he stands. Torment arose, right marvelous in France. Tempest there was of wind and thunder black. With rain and hail so much could not be spanned. Fell thunderbolts often on every hand. And verily, the earth quaked in answer back. Then there's a description of the darkness such that it's dark in the middle of the day because of the storm, and only a split in the clouds shines a little bit of light. And I guess because of the earthquake, any houses that were nearby were damaged also. Quote, no house stood there, but straight its walls must crack. In full midday the darkness was so grand, save the sky split, no light was in the land. Beheld these things with terror every man, and many said, we in the judgment stand. The end of time is presently at hand. They spake no truth, they did not understand. 'Twas the great day of mourning for Roland. End quote. So amidst this big battle, there's a big storm, and the only light is coming from a crack in the clouds. And a lot of the guys think it's the end of the world. And as a sample of some of the description of the battle, quote, marvelous is the battle in its speed. The Franks there strike with vigor and with heat, cutting through wrists and ribs and chines indeed, through garments to the lively flesh beneath. On the green grass the clear blood runs in streams. End quote. I could not figure out what chines, C-H-I-N-E-S, refers to there. I could find other people quoting this passage as chines, so it doesn't seem like it's a typo for chains, but I don't know what a chine is. Here is another example of that partial repetition. Quote, marvelous is the battle now and grand. The Franks there strike their good brown spears in hand. Then had you seen such sorrowing of clans, so many a slain, shattered and bleeding man, biting the earth or piled there on their backs. The Saracens cannot such loss withstand. Will they or nil from off the field draw back? By lively force chase them away the Franks. End quote. I was in middle school when the first Lord of the Rings movie came out, and after the movie came out, I went and got the books and started reading them. And at some point, while I was reading those, my dad said to me, oh, if you like that, you should check out the Iliad. And so then I got the Iliad, and I probably got about halfway through the Iliad. I finished it later as an adult, but when you're a kid, there's a lot of names in the Iliad, and they're hard to pronounce, and the story doesn't progress exactly the way a modern story does, and it's sort of long. But I've always appreciated my dad opening that door and pointing down that hallway into the vast galleries of ancient Greek literature. And when I was reading the Song of Roland, I felt something similar, which is that there's a lot here that I think a lot of young people, especially a lot of young guys, would really enjoy, but this piece is not very well known at all. I'd never heard of it until last year. I sort of stumbled on it. It's a little difficult to read. The language is sometimes a little challenging, and the names, sort of like the Iliad, are very unfamiliar, so they can be sometimes hard to remember exactly who was who. Not Roland and Charles and Oliver and Guinness, but some of the secondary characters. But I think the fact that it's quite short, it's about maybe a third the length of a typical novel, makes it so a high schooler could certainly read it. It might be difficult for a middle schooler. And I'm always interested in the opportunity to replace modern fantasy, things like Lord of the Rings, which I appreciate Lord of the Rings. But I think that there's a lot in real European history that would answer that desire that a lot of young guys have to read about battles and swords and kings and kingdoms and all that stuff. We actually have that in our history. We don't have to make up new things. And though the Song of Roland and the Iliad are both fictionalized accounts of something that happened, the Iliad, of course, a lot more so because it has a bunch of gods and stuff in it, and the Song of Roland to a lesser extent. By reading these, you're still getting more in touch with the history of the events about which these varying degrees of fiction were written. There is a lot going on in this next passage, so I'll just read it. Quote, "In charters and in briefs is written clear, 4,000 fell and more, the tales declare. 'Gainst 4 assaults easily did they fare, but then the 5th brought heavy griefs to bear. They all are slain, those Frankish cavaliers, only 60, whom God was pleased to spare. Before these die, they'll sell them very dear. The Count Roland great loss of his men sees. His companion Oliver calls and speaks. Sir and comrade, in God's name that you keeps, such good vassals you see lie here in heaps. For France the Deuce fair country may we weep. Of such barons long desolate she'll be. King and friend, wherefore are you not here? How, Oliver, brother, can we achieve? And by what means our news to him repeat? Says Oliver, I know not how to seek. Rather I'd die than shame come of this feat. Then says Roland, I'll wind this Oliphant. If Charles here where in the pass he stands, I pledge you now they will return the Franks. Says Oliver, great shame would come of that, and a reproach on every one your clan, that shall endure while each lives in the land. When I implored you would not do this act, doing it now, no raise from me you'll have. So wind your horn, but not by courage rash, seeing that both your arms with blood are splashed. Answers that Count, fine blows I've struck them back. Then says Roland, strong it is now, our battle. I'll wind my horn, so the king hears it, Charles. Says Oliver, that act were not a vassal's. When I implored you, comrade, you were wrathful. Were the king here, we had not borne such damage, nor should we blame those with him there his army. End quote. So there, Roland finally accepts to blow his horn to call Charles and the front of the train back to where they are to help them. And Oliver is perhaps angry that he did not do it sooner, though it is not completely clear. Finally, Roland blows the horn. And this is the moment depicted in the painting by a French painter named Louis Félix Genet, Guesnet, that I used for the cover of this episode. He's mounted on his horse, Veillantif, and he's got his sword Durandal in his hand, and he's blowing the Oliphant. Quote, Roland hath set the Oliphant to his mouth. He grasps it well, and with great virtue sounds. High are those peaks, afar it rings and loud. 30 great leagues they hear its echoes mount. So Charles heard, and all his comrades round. Then said that king, battle they do, our counts. And Genis answered, contrarious, that were a lie in any other mouth. The Count Roland with sorrow and with pangs, and with great pain sounded his Oliphant. Out of his mouth the clear blood leapt and ran. About his brain the very temples cracked. Loud is its voice, that horn he holds in hand. Charles hath heard, where in the pass he stands, and Nemus hears, and listen all the Franks. Then says the king, I hear his horn, Roland's. He'd never sound, but he were in combat. Answers him Genis, it is no battle that. Now are you old, blossoming white and blanched, yet by such words you still appear infant. You know full well the great pride of Roland. Marvel it is, God stays so tolerant. Nopals he took, not waiting your command. Thence issued forth the Saracens, a band. With vassalage had fought against Roland. He slew them first with Durandal, his brand. Then washed their blood with water from the land. So what he'd done might not be seen of man. He for a hare goes all day horn in hand. No race neath heaven in field him dare attack. So canter on, nay wherefore hold we back? The Count Roland, though blood his mouth doth stain, and burst are both the temples of his brain, his Oliphant he sounds with grief and pain. Charles hath heard, listen the Franks again. That horn, the king says, hath a mighty strain. Answers Duke Nemus, a baron blows with pain. Battle is there, indeed I see it plain. He is betrayed by one that still doth feign. Equip you, sir, cry out your old refrain. That noble band go succor them amain. Enough you've heard how Roland doth complain. End quote. He blows the horn, the king hears it, and says, we gotta go help him. And Genis says, no, don't worry about it. Nobody could beat Roland. Because, of course, Genis wants Roland dead. And you notice there is this repetition. The same moment is played over 3 times, emphasizing different aspects of what's going on each time. And this effect isn't used very often It's used at these critical moments, like when Oliver sees the Saracens and when Roland blows the horn. So by now they've figured out that Gennis betrayed them, betrayed Roland, betrayed the whole army, because he recommended that the best general, Roland, be in the rear guard, and then the rear guard gets ambushed. Then when Roland calls for help, Gennis says, no, we don't need to worry about him, he's fine. And here is the initial treatment that Gennis gets until they can decide what to do with him later. Quote, "Then Gennis' beard and both his cheeks they shaved, and 4 blows each with their closed fist they gave. They trounced him well with cudgels and with staves, and on his neck they clasped an iron chain. So like a bear enchained they held him safe. On a pack mule they set him in his shame. Kept him till Charles should call for him again. High were the peaks, and shadowy and grand. The valleys deep, the rivers swiftly ran. Trumpets they blew in rear and in the van, till all again answered that Oliphant." End quote. The most interesting part there is that they shave his beard first as a punishment, as a humiliation. And then they rough him up, chain him by the neck, and then put him on a donkey instead of on a horse. And now we're back to where Roland is. Quote, "Roland regards the bare mountainsides, dead men of France, he sees so many lie, and weeps for them as fits a gentle knight. Lords and barons, may God to you be kind, and all your souls redeem for paradise, and let you there mid holy flowers lie. Better vassals than you saw never I. Ever you've served me, and so long a time. By you Carlin hath conquered kingdoms wide. That emperor reared you for evil plight. Douce land of France, O very precious clime, laid desolate by such a sour exile. Barons of France, for me I've seen you die, and no support, no warrant could I find. God be your aid, who never yet hath lied. I must not fail now, brother, by your side. Save I be slain for sorrow shall I die. Sir companion, let us again go strike. The Count Roland back to the field then hieing, holds Durendal, and like a vassal striking, Faldrin of Puy has through the middle sliced. With 24 of all they rated highest, was never a man for vengeance showed such liking. Even as a stag before the hounds go flying, before Roland the pagans scatter frightened. Says the Archbishop, you deal now very wisely. Such valor should he show that is bred knightly, and beareth arms and a good charger rideth. In battle should be strong and proud and sprightly. Should be a monk in one of those old minsters, where day by day he'll pray for us poor sinners. Answers Roland, strike on, no quarter give them. Upon these words Franks are again beginning. Very great loss they suffer then, the Christians. The man who knows for him there is no prison in such a fight with keen defense lays on. End quote. One character we haven't talked about yet is the Archbishop, whose name is Turpin, Turpin. He appears earlier in the story, and the first time I read the Archbishop said so-and-so, I imagined a guy in big robes and maybe a hat who maybe was going to lead a prayer before the battle. And from what I can tell, the Archbishop would have been indistinguishable by his clothing from the other men there. He was fighting as much as everybody else was. And here he's even mocking monks who sit in prayer all day. Then Roland blows the Oliphant again. Quote, the Count Roland has nobly fought and well, but he is hot, and all his body sweats. Great pain he has, and trouble in his head. His temples burst when he the horn sounded. But he would know if Charles will come to them. Takes the Oliphant and feebly sounds again. That emperor stood still and listened then. My lords, said he, right evilly we fare. This day Roland, my nephew, shall be dead. I hear his horn, with scarcely any breath. Nimbly canter whoever would be there. Your trumpets sound as many as ye bear. 60,000 so loud together blare. The mountains ring, the valleys answer them. The pagans hear, they think it not a jest. Says each to each, Carlum doth us bestead. End quote. So the pagans hear those trumpets, and they know that Charles is coming for them. There is some variation in the translation of some of the names. For example, Gennis is usually called Gennis, but he's also sometimes called Ganelon. And Charles is usually called Charles, but he's also sometimes called Charlemagne or Carlin or here Carlum. Maybe this variation is in the original, or maybe this translator decided to vary the translation slightly. In this next passage, Roland and Turpin agree to make their last stand together. Quote, the Count Roland has never loved cowards, nor arrogant, nor men of evil heart, nor cavalier that was not good vassal. That Archbishop Turpin, he calls apart, Sir, you're afoot, and I my charger have. For love of you, here will I take my stand. Together we'll endure things good and bad. I'll leave you not, for no incarnate man. We'll give again these pagans their attack. The better blows are those from Durandal. Says the Archbishop, shame on him that holds back. Charles is at hand, full vengeance he'll exact. End quote. In an earlier passage, the translator used the word hieing, H-I-E-I-N-G, which I had to look up means to hurry, to hasten, to go quickly. And that word comes up again in this next passage. Then at some point, Roland passes out, and a Saracen, seeing him lying there dead, comes over and tries to get his famous sword, Durandal. And so he takes it out of the sheath, but then Roland bashes him on the head with the Oliphant and kills him. And then rather than letting the sword be captured, he tries to smash it against a rock, but the sword is unbreakable, so he can't smash it. Then he describes all the different places that he conquered using that sword on behalf of King Charles, and the relics that are hidden in its hilt, St. Peter's tooth, the blood of St. Basile, parts of a robe worn by St. Mary. Then he says of the sword, quote, "It is not right that pagans should thee seize. For Christian men your use shall ever be, nor any man's that worketh cowardice. Many broad lands with you have I retrieved, which Charles holds, who hath that great white beard, wherefore that king so proud and rich is he." End quote. And then after that is the death of Roland. Quote, "But Roland feels he's no more time to speak. Looking to Spain, he lies on a sharp peak. And with one hand upon his breast he beats, Mea culpa, God by thy virtues clean me from my sins, the mortal and the mean, which from the hour that I was born have been until this day when life is ended here." Holds out his glove towards God. As he speaks, angels descend from heaven on that scene. The Count Roland, beneath a pine he sits. Turning his eyes towards Spain, he begins remembering so many diverse things, so many lands where he went conquering, and France the Deuce, the heroes of his kin, and Charlemagne, his lord who nourished him. Nor can he help but weep and sigh at this. But his own self, he's not forgotten him, his own faults, and God's forgiveness bids. Very Father, in whom no falsehood is, Saint Lazarin from death thou didst remit, and Daniel saved from the lion's pit, my soul in me preserve from all perils, and from the sins I did in life commit. His right-hand glove, to God he offers it. Saint Gabriel from his hand hath taken it. Over his arm, his head bows down and slips. He joins his hands, and so is life finished. God sent him down his angel cherubim, and Saint Michael we worship in peril, and by their side Saint Gabriel alit. So the Count's soul they bear to paradise. Roland is dead, his soul to heaven God bear. That emperor to Roncesvalles doth fare. There was no path nor passage anywhere, nor of waste ground, nor ell, nor foot to spare, without a Frank or pagan lying there. End quote. King Charles's dreams are also a recurring pattern in the poem. Much earlier in the poem, he dreams that Yennelis grabs his spear from him and breaks it in two, and at another time, there's an evil bear that is gnawing on his right arm, and then a leopard attacks him, and then he fights them both off. And here, much later in the poem, we have another dream of Charles's. Charles, like a man worn out with labor, slept. Saint Gabriel the Lord to him hath sent, whom as a guard o'er the emperor he set. Stood all night long that angel by his head. In a vision announced he to him then, a battle should be fought against him yet. Significance of griefs demonstrated. Charles looked up towards the sky, and there thunders and winds and blowing gales beheld, and hurricanes and marvelous tempests, lightnings and flames he saw in readiness, that speedily on all his people fell. Apple and ash, their spear shafts all burned, also their shields, e'en the golden bosses, crumbled the shafts of their trenchant lances, crushed their hauberks and all their steel helmets. His cavaliers he saw in great distress. Bears and leopards would feed upon them next. Adversaries, dragons, wyverns, serpents. Griffins were there, 30,000, no less. Nor was there one but on some Frank it set. And the Franks cried, Charlemagne, give help. Wherefore the king must grief and pity felt. He'd go to them, but was in duress kept. Out of a wood came a great lion then. 'Twas very proud and fierce and terrible. His body deer sought out, and on him leapt. Each in his arms wrestling, the other held. But he knew not which conquered, nor which fell. That emperor woke not at all, but slept. End quote. There's one unusual word in particular there that you probably heard. That word was wyvern, W-Y-V-E-R-N. And a wyvern in European literature, mythology, folklore is a dragon with two legs and 2 wings, and often a long tail with a stinger on the end of it. And the difference between a dragon and a wyvern is that a dragon has 4 legs and a wyvern has 2. When King Charles hears that Roland is dead, he's of course very sad and he grieves at it. And then he has another more practical concern. Quote, Roland, my friend, fair youth that bearest the bell, when I arrive at Aix in my chapelle, men coming there will ask what news I tell. I'll say to them, marvelous news, and fell. My nephew's dead who won for me such realms. Against me then the Saxon will rebel. Hungar, Bulgar, and many hostile men. Roman, Poulon, all those are in Palerne, and in Afrique, and those in Califerne. Afresh then will my pain and suffering swell, for who will lead my armies with such strength when he is slain that all our days us led? End quote. He knows that a lot of other nations that he governs will rebel when they hear that Roland is dead because he's such a powerful general that he was what was keeping them in check. The poet then describes the army that Charles has to launch this counterstrike on the Saracens, and it says that the first 3 columns are Franks, the 4th are Germans, the 5th are Normans, the 6th are Britons, the 7th are Pedavins and Barons from Auvergne, which are both regions of France, and then the 8th are Flemings. So it's a fairly pan-European army that he has. And you'll notice early in this next passage that Charles turns toward the east to pray, which many people don't know that Christians for a long time turned toward Jerusalem, or at least turned eastward in order to pray. And many churches are built so that the apse, the front main part of the church where the pastor sits, that part of the church is facing east toward Jerusalem, or just generally eastward, so that everybody in the church is facing that way when they pray. The important word in this next passage being orient, which means east. Quote, that emperor down from his horse descends, to the green grass kneeling his face he bends, then turns his eyes towards the orient, calls upon God with heartiest intent. Very Father, this day to me defend, who to Jonas succor didst truly send, out of the whale's belly where he was pent, and who did spare the king of Nineveh, and Daniel from marvelous torment, when he was caged within the lion's den, and 3 children all in a fire ardent. Thy gracious love to me be here present. In thy mercy, if it please thee, consent that my nephew Roland I may avenge. When he had prayed, upon his feet he stepped. With the strong mark of virtue signed his head. Upon his swift charger the king mounted, while Josrins and Nemus his stirrup held. He took his shield, his trenchant spear he kept. Fine limbs he had, both gallant and well set. Clear was his face and filled with good intent. Vigorously he cantered onward thence. In front, in rear, they sounded their trumpets. Above them all boomed the Oliphant again. Then all the Franks for pity of Roland wept. End quote. In describing the army of the Saracens, a number of nations are listed. Those are the Turks, the Persians, the Huns, and a half dozen other nations that I could not place anywhere, but probably medieval scholars know what these are referring to. Those are the Pinsoners, the Sultras, the Avars, the Ormalius, the Uges, the Brus, the Osclavers, and there's a desert called the Oxyant, which kind of sounds like Occidental, like Western, but it's Oxyant, O-C-C-I-N-T. It also mentions the tribe of Samuel being among them. And then as these 2 armies stand opposite each other, the scene is described thus, quote, great are the hosts, and all the columns fair. No peak, nor vale, nor cliff between them there. Thicket, nor wood, nor ambush anywhere. Across the plain they see each other well, end quote. And a bit further down, quote, clear as the day, the sun radiant. The hosts are fair, the companies are grand. The first columns are come now, hand to hand, end quote. Then Charles meets with an admiral on the field, and the admiral strikes him, wounding him pretty badly. But then Gabriel appears to him and essentially tells him to get up. And so he does, and Charles recovers. Quote, in the admiral is much great virtue found. He strikes Carlin on his steel helm so brown, has broken it and rent above his brow. Through his thick hair the sword goes glancing round. A great palm's breadth and more of flesh cuts out, so that all bare the bone is in that wound. Charles tottereth, falls nearly to the ground. God wills not he be slain or overpowered. Saint Gabriel once more to him comes down and questions him, great king, what doest thou? Charles, hearing how that holy angel spake, had fear of death no longer nor dismay. Remembrance and a fresh vigor he's gained. So the admiral he strikes with France's blade. His helmet breaks whereon the jewels blaze. slices his head to scatter all his brains, and down onto the white beard all his face. So he falls dead, recovers not again. Montjoie, cries Charles, that all may know the tale. End quote. So there is one instance of Montjoie appearing, but it comes up several times in the poem. Another thing I like about that passage is that the admiral hits him pretty hard, and he stumbles and he's about to go down, and then Gabriel comes and says, "Great king, what doest thou?" He says, "What are you doing?" And then Charles gets a grip. It's just a funny thing for an angel to say, "What doest thou? What are you doing?" This next passage has a few different things going on, but without explaining too much beforehand, I'll just say that Bramamund is the wife of King Marsile. So she's the queen, the Saracen queen. And Syracuse, or Saragus is how it's spelled here, is the place that the Franks originally had besieged and from which they withdrew. And if you're also looking at a text of this, you should be careful with the names, because the names are not always translated in the same way. For example, Saragus or Syracuse is sometimes translated as Saragoza or Zaragoza or something like that. So the names that you're looking at might be slightly different from the names that I'm giving, or if you go to read about it, the names might vary a little bit. So watch out for that. The other thing is that in this next passage, it uses the word Mahumari, which I've never seen anywhere else. And it looks like it's an old-fashioned word for a mosque. They're calling Muhammad Mahum, and a Mahumari is a place where they talk about or think about Muhammad. That's apparently how they thought about Islam in those days. Though that's not a terrible description, honestly. The passage reads, quote, "Great was the heat, the dust arose and blew. Still pagans fled and hotly Franks pursued. The chase endured from there to Syracuse. On her tower, high up, clomb Bramamund. Around her there the clerks and canons stood of the false law, whom God ne'er loved nor knew. Orders they'd none, nor were their heads tonsured. And when she saw those Arabites confused, aloud she cried, 'Give us your aid, Mahum! Noble king, conquered are all our troops, and the admiral to shameful slaughter put.' When Marsile heard, towards the wall he looked, wept from his eyes, and all his body stooped. So died of grief. With sins he's so corrupt. The soul of him to hell live devils took. Pagans are slain, the rest are put to rout, whom Charles hath in battle overpowered. Of Syracuse the gates he's battered down, for well he knows there's no defense there now. In come his men, he occupies that town, and all that night they lie there in their power. Fierce is that king, with his hoary beard and proud, and Bramamund hath yielded up her towers, but 10 ere great and lesser 50 around. Great exploits his, whom the Lord God endows. Passes the day, the darkness is grown deep, but all the stars burn and the moon shines clear. And Syracuse is in the emperor's keep. 1,000 Franks he bids seek through the streets, the synagogues and the Mohammeries. With iron mauls and axes which they wield, they break the idols and all the imageries. So there remain no fraud nor falsity." End quote. So the Franks fight from this battle in the mountain pass all the way back to Syracuse. They chase the Saracens all the way back, and then they capture Syracuse. And King Marsile, you saw, he just drops dead at the sight of the collapse of his army. And there's a description of the towers. There's 10 big ones and then 50 smaller ones. And then at the end, Charles sends a group of guys to go to all the synagogues and mosques, presumably, in the town. And it doesn't seem like he orders them destroyed, but they break the idols and all the imageries. So maybe they go into them and destroy the various icons and statues and whatever else might be in there that could constitute an idol. There's a debate first about what to do about Gennis. And in the end, he's executed in a particularly grim way. And I won't go into that in any detail, except there's a nice line. In that section, it says, quote, "Who betrays man himself and friends undoes," end quote. So when you betray somebody, you don't only undo them, you undo yourself also by your betrayal. And the closing lines of the poem are as follows. Quote, "When the emperor his justice hath achieved, his mighty wrath's abated from its heat, and Bramamund has christening received. Passes the day, the darkness is grown deep, and now that king in his vaulted chamber sleeps. Saint Gabriel is come from God and speaks. Summon the hosts, Charles, of thine empire. Go thou by force into the land of Byre. King Vivian thou'lt succor there at Imphi, in the city which pagans have besieged. The Christians there implore thee and beseech. Right loth to go, that emperor was he. God, said the king, my life is hard indeed. Tears filled his eyes, he tore his snowy beard. So ends the tale which Turld hath conceived." End quote. So even as the story ends, Gabriel comes to Charles again in a dream and says, "You've got more work to do. You got to go over here and help these Christians who are besieged." And the king is exhausted. He's loath to go. He's loath to go. He doesn't want to go. And he says, "My life is hard indeed." And historians haven't been able to figure out who Thorold is. The poem has this last line, "So ends the tale which Thorold hath conceived." So Thorold is presumably the one who wrote this poem or wrote it down initially, but they don't know who that is. Those are the passages that I wanted to read you from the Song of Roland. I've been enjoying getting into medieval literature recently, and this one also I enjoyed very much. The Middle Ages are often called the Dark Ages, this period basically from the collapse of the Roman Empire to the start of the Renaissance. And we think of them in a certain way, I think at least in part because we don't have very many records from that period, both written and visual. All of the visual records from that period are of this medieval art in which they had not yet figured out the laws of perspective, and so the people look a little bit funny and the buildings are smaller than the people sometimes, and so they don't usually provoke a really strong feeling in us when we look at them. Fortunately, the written records are a little better. When we looked at Asser's Life of King Alfred in another episode of this podcast, we saw how detailed a written record from the Middle Ages can be. But these texts aren't really emphasized because they can sometimes be hard to read. But I'm looking forward to reading more of them, and I have some more on my list for this year because I want to learn more about the Middle Ages. Because while the visual art might sometimes be a little unimpressive, though I do like looking at medieval art, partially because I like to try to imagine what that artist was seeing. The image that they prepared might look a little bit funny to our eye, but they were looking at something that impressed them, whether it was a king or a battle or a castle or something. Something impressed them, and they could see that very clearly, and they couldn't transfer it exactly into the medium that they were working with, but they were looking at something, and I like to try to imagine what it was they were looking at from that picture that they produced. But anyway, even though the visual art might be a little bit less developed, the written word has changed practically not at all in the last 3,000 years. The writing implement has changed a little, and styles of writing maybe have changed. But it's not as though our ability to represent something, to present something again with words, has improved dramatically since the Middle Ages. Our ability to reproduce an image has obviously massively improved. Never mind the laws of perspective that they figured out in the Renaissance, but more importantly, photographs and satellite photographs, and our ability to represent something as an image has changed dramatically, but our ability to represent something as a text has not changed at all. It still lies simply in the skill and attention of the writer. And even though we have computers to type with, and over the centuries they've used various writing implements, quills and fountain pens and the typewriter, none of those change our ability to write something. So medieval texts are still a very good and vivid way to try to access that period. And we've done a little bit of that today. And among many other things, the medieval period is the soil out of which the Renaissance grew. The Renaissance first occurred in what we would call medieval societies. And from the Renaissance came the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and the Industrial Revolution and the rest of it up to today. So this period is a significant one in the development of European civilization, and I'm excited to look into it more deeply. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go to my website, vollrathpublishing.com. That's VOLLRATH publishing.com. I'll put the link in the description, and buy some books. I only have one book published now, but I'm very proud of it. I'm very happy with how it came out. It's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I have it at a good price. I offer free shipping anywhere in the United States. It's very good print quality. We put a lot of work into it. I'm very happy with it, and I'm looking forward to doing more similar projects in the future. So I hope you'll go check that out. Buy yourself a copy. It makes an excellent gift. I know my favorite gifts are usually books, and you can't go wrong with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you've never read it, you definitely should. It's excellent. I read it for the first time a few years ago, thinking that it was this sort of goofy, cartoonish story that had been rehashed a lot over 200 years, and it absolutely is not that. It has a lot to talk about, a lot to think about. It's maybe more relevant today than it was even when it was written because of the reflection that it provokes about science and technology. And I really think that no library would be complete without it. I'm not sure if any library is complete ever, but I'm inclined to think that a personal library could not be complete without Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I hope that you'll go and check that out, support your own library, support the podcast, and that's all I have to say for today. Farewell. Until next time, take care and happy reading.